In 1962, Brian Epstein walked into my office with a record of this group called the Beatles, which I thought was such a stupid name.
More than just a producer, George Martin was the one who paved the way for the Beatles to enter their own creative territory. He not only shaped the way they recorded and organized ideas but also pioneered techniques that allowed the band to move beyond the boundaries of 1960s pop music. Along that journey, Paul McCartney was the one Martin was most closely connected with, a perfectionist, controlling, and always proposing bold ideas. Although he participated in hundreds of recording sessions, Martin rarely spoke publicly about the personal bond between him and McCartney. What we know mostly comes from studio notes, indirect accounts, or scattered behind-the-scenes footage. Behind an iconic collaborative relationship were countless disagreements, adjustments, and compromises. Martin once described himself as McCartney's musical translator, but the relationship was always more complex than it appeared. And now, we will open up that story. On June 6, 1962, at the EMI studios on Abbey Road, London, the Beatles had their first recording audition. George Martin, then a producer at Parlophone, a small division of EMI, was tasked with evaluating the young band from Liverpool. Although he was not entirely won over by the recording, he quickly noticed one member, Paul McCartney, who showed unusual initiative and perceptiveness. While John Lennon remained cautious and George Harrison relatively quiet, McCartney was actively conversing with the technicians, asking questions about recording techniques, and emphasizing ideas related to harmony and orchestration. To Martin, who was used to having full control over the production process, that behavior was unfamiliar. He saw in McCartney a mind full of ideas but lacking direction and not easily persuaded. From the beginning, disagreements emerged around song selection. Martin did not think highly of Love Me Do, believing its structure too simple, while McCartney firmly defended it. In the end, the recording was adjusted to Martin's preferences, the tempo was shortened, and the harmonica part was pushed to the beginning. Surprisingly, the released version charted, prompting both sides to reconsider their views of each other. One of Martin's first interventions was suggesting the replacement of drummer Pete Best with Ringo Starr. Though not an easy decision for the group, Martin believed they needed someone who could blend musically and personally in the studio. McCartney, though initially resistant, eventually agreed. This decision laid the foundation for a more stable group structure and also showed Martin's willingness to take responsibility for long-term decisions. In those early sessions, Martin often wrote down personal impressions after each recording. Some notes were specifically about McCartney, commenting on his musical control, work ethic, and maturity beyond his years. Years later, he once shared, "Paul was the only one who made me explain why an idea wouldn't work." In the early phase of their collaboration, there were many clashes over tempo, over key, over recording techniques. But it was through those disagreements that both began to recognize each other's capabilities. McCartney did not submit to Martin, but he listened. Martin did not back down but always sought to offer technical reasoning instead of emotional argument. They did not build a relationship on similarity or closeness but learned to coexist with differences. And as trust gradually grew, the roles of both became clearer, no longer a struggle for control but a collaboration based on each person's strengths, opening up an unprecedented creative era in popular music. When harmony reached its peak between 1965 and 1967, the Beatles not only reached the height of fame but also entered an unprecedented phase of intense creativity. 3 consecutive albums, Rubber Soul, Revolver, and especially Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, marked their transformation from a performing band into a model of all-encompassing studio artistry. In that process, the bond between Paul McCartney and George Martin evolved into a unique form of collaboration, not based on hierarchy but shaped by a seamless combination of skill and imagination. McCartney no longer simply brought melodies to the studio, he arrived with visions for orchestration, harmony demands, and a complete presentation of the soundscape. Instead of restraining that eagerness, Martin embraced it and translated vague ideas into concrete production processes. When McCartney introduced Eleanor Rigby, a song with folk overtones, simple, lacking space, Martin proposed eliminating all familiar instruments, replacing them with an 8-piece string ensemble. He arranged the opening in the style of Bartok, no harmony, no background layers. The result was a recording that felt both cinematic and concise, with no drums or guitar. Martin was not just someone who realized ideas, he examined and set clear boundaries. In For No One, although McCartney recorded nearly all the music himself, Martin still insisted on adding a French horn to balance the tone. When McCartney seemed unsure about the combination, Martin quickly sketched the arrangement and invited Alan Civil from the London Symphony Orchestra to record in just 4 takes. For Martin, boundaries were what protected the song from unnecessary excess. A Day in the Life was an unusual case, with a structure made up of 2 separate parts, one by Lennon, one by McCartney. Martin did not ask for framework changes but proposed linking them with a transition using a 40-piece orchestra playing a gradual build-up over 24 bars in a semi-random fashion. The recording session was charged with drama. The orchestra wore suits but were allowed to don masks, hats, and face paint as they wished. Martin personally managed the volume and tape processing to ensure the final chord extended for nearly a minute without distortion. During this period, they worked like 2 poles of a self-contained creative machine, one asking, "What if we did this?" the other testing it through practicality and technique. Disagreements emerged, but they were not personal. When McCartney suggested using reverse tape in Rain, Martin did not oppose it, only asked for a test comparison beforehand. McCartney agreed, and the reverse sound was deliberately placed at the end of the track. Still, things did not always run smoothly. Many times, McCartney brought in drafts that were too complex or couldn't be executed in time. At times, he entered the studio with a few scribbled chords on a napkin and demanded a rushed arrangement. Martin did not refuse but set clear terms. If time was limited, the orchestration would be pared down as much as necessary. That agreement became a principle between spontaneity and calculation. They adjusted each other within an acceptable range, enough to preserve structure without losing surprise. This phase not only marked the peak of the Beatles' career but also demonstrated an ideal model of how a producer could play a role in creative dialogue, not just a technical operator. Martin did not impose personal marks, but thanks to him, McCartney's ideas moved beyond raw form to become fully realized, systematic products. Success came not because they were alike but because they learned to exploit their differences as an advantage. Still, as that collaborative structure began to loosen and McCartney moved further into a coordinating role, the line between control and creativity grew thin. Tensions gradually began to surface in the next stage of the journey. Silent dissolution. The White Album is seen as the Beatles' most ambitious, chaotic musical journey. Recorded over nearly half a year, the album consists of 30 songs with distinctly different tones and goals, most of them developed in isolation by individual members. In that context, George Martin, who had tightly controlled the production process of previous albums, was gradually pushed away from the center, no longer organizing unified recording sessions. This time, he had to work separately with each member, often without prior notice. At this point, Paul McCartney intensified his control over the creative process. He frequently came to the studio with ready-made arrangements, requested isolated recordings, took on multiple instrumental parts himself, and even worked with a separate sound engineer when Martin was absent. Some tracks, like Martha My Dear, were recorded entirely without the presence of any other Beatles member. Although Martin did not openly object, he did not hide his exhaustion either. In an interview about the recording process, he sighed, "They were no longer a band, and I was no longer the producer." Jeff Emerick, the veteran sound engineer who had accompanied the group on many projects, walked out halfway through the work after a particularly tense session. McCartney demanded a complete redo of the bass part due to dissatisfaction with the mix, while Lennon and Harrison were both absent. Feeling that his role was no longer respected and that the pressure had exceeded his limits, Emerick decided to leave the studio on the spot. Martin did not stop him. He saw it as a clear sign of the silent collapse of a once solid collaborative structure. The turmoil in the studio at this point reflected the fractures within the band. Musical style disagreements, management disputes, personal conflicts all coexisted. McCartney, perhaps in an effort to preserve creative momentum, tightened his grip on coordination even more. But rather than leading a united group, he seemed to be operating as a solo entity in a system where Martin no longer played the guiding role. One notable moment occurred when McCartney brought in a new arrangement of Ebla-Di, Abla-Di, and requested a complete overhaul. Lennon openly disliked the original version, while Martin remained silent. After several failed attempts, Lennon suddenly walked into the studio, sat at the piano, and played the opening in his own style, unplanned, unsolicited. McCartney immediately agreed, and Martin completed the recording in a single session. It was one of the rare instances of effective collaboration during this tense period, and it came entirely from spontaneity, not planning. After the White Album, Martin was almost entirely uninvolved in the Let It Be project. The whole process of filming and recording was handed over to an independent team. When the initial mix fell apart, the group invited Phil Spector, master of the Wall of Sound technique, to salvage it. McCartney initially agreed so the project could be completed. But after hearing the final mix, he was furious. He considered the string arrangements in the long and winding road excessive and unfaithful to the song's spirit. McCartney called Martin and complained, "I no longer recognize my own song." Martin calmly replied, "You gave it to someone else, Paul." It was one of the few times George Martin openly expressed his opinion about a product he did not directly oversee. Even so, he did not criticize anyone, nor did he try to reclaim his former role. From that point on, Martin began turning down projects related to the Beatles, not out of resentment but because he understood the boundary between what belonged to him and what had ended. While no one could be certain whether the relationship between him and McCartney could ever be repaired, one thing was clear: when the name the Beatles no longer bound them, they found common ground once again, this time as two independent artists. A timeless connection between two souls. In 1970, when the Beatles officially disbanded, not only did the band come to an end, but many relationships also closed their chapters. However, between George Martin and Paul McCartney, the collaboration did not cease. It merely changed form. They continued to work together on other projects, no longer influenced by the machinery of the band and free from the internal pressure or the underlying power structures that once existed during the Beatles era. Their relationship had now become an encounter between two mature individuals, each playing a distinct role in a creative process without constraints. A major milestone came in 1973 when McCartney was invited to compose the theme song for Live and Let Die, one of the most successful entries in the James Bond franchise. He personally invited George Martin to produce the title track. This marked the first official collaboration between the two since Abbey Road. Without Lennon, without Harrison, and outside the familiar Abbey Road studio, the setting had changed, but their roles remained intact. McCartney brought in a melody with a completed chorus, while Martin handled the orchestration, organized a large-scale ensemble, and created smooth transitions between contrasting musical sections. The recording stood out not only among previous Bond songs but also came to be regarded as a pinnacle in 1970s film music. From there, a new chapter began. In the 1980s, as McCartney searched for direction after the Wings era, Martin, now in his 50s, maintained his meticulous working style, checking every orchestral detail, every downbeat. The two joined forces on Tug of War, 1982, followed by Pipes of Peace, 1983. In an environment free of the tension that once existed during the Beatles' years, their working process flowed smoothly, almost reviving the ideal model of collaboration they had once hoped for. At this point, Martin was not merely the man behind the control desk. He actively contributed ideas for shaping the album's concept, selecting tracks, and suggesting guest artists. For Tug of War, it was he who proposed inviting Stevie Wonder to collaborate on What's That You're Doing. A bold surprise, demonstrating his willingness to broaden the scope of collaboration. Knowing that McCartney had placed full trust in him, the album was later regarded as McCartney's most outstanding work since the Beatles. And once again, Martin was part of that success. Between them, there was no friendship in the conventional sense. They did not frequently appear together or share personal matters in public. Still, those close to them recounted that they stayed in touch through handwritten letters or phone calls. Giles Martin, George's son, once shared, "My father had a shelf dedicated to Paul's demo tapes, not to store them, but because it made him happy knowing Paul was still writing." Even though they no longer worked together regularly, George Martin always expressed a special respect for McCartney in interviews. When asked who had taught him the most throughout his career, he answered without hesitation, "Paul. He always knew exactly what he wanted. My challenge was to find a way to make that happen within realistic limits and frameworks." In an industry where clashes between creativity and production are commonplace, the decades-long collaboration between Martin and McCartney was a rare exception. It was not based on friendship nor on loyalty but sustained by mutual respect, each person fully aware of their role and careful not to overstep into the other's domain. When George Martin passed away, McCartney did not hold a grand memorial. But through what he shared, it is clear that Martin's role went far beyond the boundaries of a producer. A quiet echo from the one who remained. On March 8, 2016, George Martin passed away, concluding a life that spanned a full 90 years. In his first statement following the sad news, Paul McCartney wrote briefly but meaningfully, "He was a true gentleman, a genius of the studio, and a second father to me." The message was not long but carried deep weight, for in more than half a century of working together, McCartney had rarely offered such personal, heartfelt words to anyone, especially those who had shared in his professional life. Shortly after, McCartney held a private memorial at a small chapel in Oxfordshire. There were no media cameras, no speeches, only a piano, a few close friends, and one unreleased recording played at the end. It was a demo recorded in 1981, edited by George Martin himself. The handwritten note on the outside simply read, "Unfinished but honest enough." From that moment on, Martin's name appeared more often in McCartney's interviews, not in the form of worn-out praise but as a quiet point of reference. Whenever speaking about orchestration, arrangements, or recording techniques, McCartney often recalled things Martin had taught him, from how to balance electronic instruments with acoustic ones to using silence as a structural element in music. When recounting moments when Martin rejected a proposal, he did not emphasize the disagreement but highlighted the consideration that sometimes Martin simply needed more time to re-evaluate the matter. To Paul, Martin was not someone who had passed. He was more like a system of thought that Paul still reflected upon in each new work. In a conversation with Giles Martin in 2022, McCartney confided, "I still hear George's voice when composing. Sometimes I want to add a string section at the end of a song, and in my head, I hear the question, are you doing this for the song or to prove something?" According to him, questions like that serve as a compass to keep music from descending into meaningless showmanship. That presence became even clearer when McCartney faced new musical technologies. As artificial intelligence began being used to recreate the voices and styles of deceased artists, he was among the first to speak out about ethical boundaries. During a 2023 hearing at the UK Parliament, he stated, "The real voice isn't in the frequency. It's in the context, in the moment, and in the relationship with the listener." When a reporter asked whether George Martin could be brought back using AI, McCartney shook his head, "No way. We used to sit together for hours in silence. No machine understands the meaning of those silences." Some handwritten documents released by Martin's family after his death also revealed thoughts he had never spoken aloud. In one undated note, Martin wrote, "Paul is not easy to work with. But that very insecurity kept me from being careless. If he was too demanding, it was because he didn't want to lose what the music was waiting for." In another shorter note, Martin left the line, "I orchestrated the process, but he brought the reason for that process to exist." There was no formal farewell, no final letter. But in every small reaction McCartney showed when mentioning Martin and in every page of Martin's notes about McCartney, one could recognize a relationship that needed no emotional climax. It was sustained by enduring professional standards. The bond between Paul McCartney and George Martin was not simply a friendship nor just a relationship between artist and producer. It was a symbiosis between two value systems, one representing the boundless spirit of the artist, the other a symbol of structure and control. Though they clashed, paused, and sometimes worked apart, they never denied each other's role in the creative journey. And when only one of them continued that path, the other's presence still remained as an unchanging standard for how a song should be made. How do you feel about the relationship between George Martin and Paul McCartney? Don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments section. And if you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next video.